Hello everyone! With the recent improvements to the official Duels game modes, I've noticed that a lot of players have gotten an interest in picking up some moving geoguessr skills. I figured I'd create a short series in which I share my best tips and tricks. In this episode, I'll share general advice, and later I'll share more country-specific advice as well. The first and perhaps most important tip I have relates to scanning. So here, the way I would find this is that I start scanning at this zoom level and you see Żabiak is immediately visible. Whereas what a lot of new players would do is start scanning at something like this. Or, this. Where a lot of place names all show at once, many of them tiny villages that you almost never see signs to. Whereas if you say, okay, I know every single place name at certain zoom level, let's scan one more zoomed in. If I want to find Shavnik, and assume I don't see Żabiak, you can still be like, okay, I can't see Shavnik here. Let's next zoom level, and then I can see Shavnik. And that's something I noticed that pretty much everyone who just starts at the moving will start at something like this, like super zoomed in, much more zoomed in than necessary. And the way I would approach it is always start fairly zoomed out and then keep zooming in more and more. Another thing I notice, especially a lot of no-move players do, is that they'll have the minimap at something like this size. I think that's also not ideal because then you just fit so much less information on your screen. What I always do when I play moving games is keep the minimap at the biggest possible size. The next most important skill is being able to visualize your surroundings as well as possible. So here, for example, I can look in the compass and say, okay, there is a big main road to the east of me. Another trick that you can use is that if you line up the compass to point directly north and then look down, then the angle of the road will be the exact same that it appears on the map. And using that, you can very easily disambiguate between potential similar intersections. So let's see how I can put that to use here. So again, we got Żabiak and Shavnik, and I can see that there is a kind of a four-way and the road does a turn. So I can take a quick look. Nothing really makes a lot of sense. And I will, okay, that means I missed something. And then I look again. Oh, that looks good. Turns make sense. And that kind of has to be the 5k then. And yeah, that is correct. Here's a slightly clearer example of lining up the road. Where, here, for example, I know that I've got the M4 to Dublin, which is somewhere here, intersecting with the R406 at some point. And that the angle at which I'm going above the M4 is like this. I could just be like, okay, could this be the place where I go above the M4? Kind of, but there's no R406 nearby. And then there is the R406, there is the R406, but we are not on there. And look, the bridge angle and the road angle will be the exact same. And as you can see, that is in fact a 5k. A closely related skill is being able to remember where you're driving and what you've seen on the way there. So for instance, as I spawn in here, I immediately take note that there's a lake to my east and that I am currently driving west. Other things that are good to remember are, for example, train lines, river crossings, etc. Basically anything that is pretty easy to find on the map. And that will help you just find the actual pinpoint a lot faster. So for example, here, as I drive next to the sign, as soon as I find the information pretty much, I can just be like, okay, this is the lake, this is where I have to be, because there's pretty much only one option with a lake next to a main road. I don't even have to go back to spawn to confirm. Another very important thing is that you should have a plan going into every round. So for example, some countries have great road signs and great road numbering systems. Others put place names on advertisements everywhere, others put them on the pins, etc, etc. So when you load in, you should think, okay, what can I find here? So that you make sure that you don't read stuff that is just never going to be useful for you. With a bit of practice, you can even decide whether something is going to be useful or not before the image even fully loads in. That way you don't have to just stop and think every frame, but you can just move until you find something that you might think might be useful. Of course, what is useful differs from country to country, and sometimes even from state to state. If I try to include everything here, then this video would be like several hours long, so I'm just going to break it down by country in follow-up videos. But for now, here are a couple examples of what you might find useful. Most countries will have some sort of a road sign. Obviously, it differs how they look, and it also differs how useful they are. For example, some countries like putting far away places that you will probably know on their signs, and others just point to nearby places. Also, some have great road numbering systems and some don't. But if you see some sort of road sign, that is usually quite helpful. Many countries will also often have waystones or kilometer markers by the side of the road, often with road numbers and sometimes even with place names. How useful it is differs from country to country. So, for example, in Cambodia or Thailand, they are pretty much your only tool for 5King unless you know how to read the language. While in others, it might be less useful. But in general, in most places, they're quite good. As a general observation, countries with waystones tend to be more helpful. With kilometer markers, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. A somewhat related note, many Latin American countries have place names and sometimes even region names on political advertisements that are graffitied on the wall. Construction signs, especially if they're government funded, will also quite often contain helpful place name information. You might have to learn a couple of words in each language in order to be able to read them fast, but usually it's not too much. It's just things like municipality or region or highway. Especially in areas like Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Africa, you very often see some sort of a government construction sign which will usually have some sort of uniform styling and information about the region and the city, which can be very, very helpful if you know how to read them quickly. There are also lots of other sources of information which you might find helpful. Some are quite straightforward, for example, bins that just say the place name, while others may require a little bit more learning. So, for example, street signs that are region specific, or phone codes, or state highway shields in the USA. Whether or not you will find this helpful depends strongly on the country and also on your skill level, but in general, some amount of additional learning alongside playing the game is recommended, I would say. You can also benefit a lot from learning different writing systems. In general, I would say most of them are not required. I think Cyrillic is a given since you can learn it in probably an hour and it is super, super useful. Others like Bengali or Thai or Khmer can be a little bit more involved, so I would say they're not necessary if you're just starting out, but they're certainly helpful if you're already quite good at moving. Of course, no move skills are also quite helpful, since if you're able to narrow down the region, that means that you will have an easier time scanning even for tiny place names. That said, there's one thing I noticed no move mains do that I would generally warn against, which is that they first try to find some sort of a meta that they know, say a pole top or something, before moving on to trying to find actual information. I think this is generally not the way to go, just because oftentimes you will come up to information that will find you the region already, and you will have wasted a lot of time. And if the information you find first is some sort of a tiny place name that you will never be able to find otherwise, then you can just find your meta afterwards anyway. Of course, this may seem quite intimidating at first, but I promise that you can pick up on it quite easily just by a little bit of playing and maybe watching people like Blinky or Anna play. And as I mentioned earlier, I will also go through what I find most helpful in each country in future videos. You will also face a lot of decisions in your moving games. So for example, which way do you want to drive? Some of the advice you can get is fairly obvious, that if you see a sign, you want to move towards it, that if you see a bigger road, you probably want to go on it, or that if you see a curve, then you probably want to move past it just so that you can check that there isn't a sign hidden behind it. But others are a little bit more obscure and situational. So, for example, a lot of the times you want to move downhill, or a lot of the times you want to move to where the Google car came from, or that if you suddenly get Gen 3 when the imagery was Gen 4 before, then you might be going in the wrong direction. Or even things like if you are in a country like Norway, where most of the population lives in the south, then you could consider driving south. That said, a lot of this advice is very situational and often conflicting. So sometimes the Google car will have come from uphill, and then you're faced with the decision of, okay, which rule of thumb do I trust first? And unfortunately, there isn't really a clear answer to it. It's a lot of it is intuition, and a lot of that intuition just comes with practice. And this then brings me to my last point, which is that the most important thing you could do is just practice. Because this will help you develop this sort of intuition, and it will help you understand how to visualize your surroundings faster, and it will help you find what's useful information faster. And yeah, practice is pretty much irreplaceable. If you have someone you can play co-op with, whether it's an experienced player or whether it's someone who's also just looking into picking up moving skills, it's also super helpful, because then you can just focus on just scanning for a round and just trying to find information for a round. And in my opinion, that is a great way to learn both of them faster than if you were playing solo, because then you just have to focus on everything all at once, which can be quite demanding early on. To bring it all together, here's an explained clip of one of my previous speedrun rounds. As I load in, first take a look at the place names that I'm confronted with: Kanija, Adorian, and then in the other direction, Stenta, that you will see in a second. Then, since I have a rough vibe guess that it has to be northern Serbia, I line up the road and start scanning, very zoomed out. This is indeed quite helpful since I find Senta really quickly, and having the angles makes me find Adorian super early on. Then just understand where the river is, and it's an immediate 5k. That concludes everything for this video. If you liked it, subscribe so that you don't miss it when I upload my videos about country-specific clues. And remember, scan zoomed out, use the compass, and have fun with GeoGuessr.